I never thought I would see the day when everything we worked for, every dollar saved with sweat and sacrifice, would vanish in the blink of an eye. We had no vacations, no luxuries, just years of honest labor and quiet endurance, always telling ourselves that one day those savings would carry us into a peaceful old age. But that dream collapsed the moment I opened our account and saw the numbers staring back at me. Not the comfort of a lifetime's work, but an empty balance, drained to nothing. And what cut deeper than the loss itself was knowing who had done it, the very person we trusted most, the one we thought would protect us as much as we had protected him. My hands shook, my chest grew tight, and for a moment I could not breathe, because betrayal is heavier than poverty, and heartbreak has a sound. It is silence, followed by the slow realization that love does not always keep you safe. Thank you for watching and for giving me a little of your time. It means more than I can ever say. And before I go on with my story, I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because sometimes sharing these truths feels a little lighter when I know someone out there is listening. I sit here remembering how it felt in that moment when I discovered everything was gone. The way my body froze. The way my thoughts raced in circles like a storm I could not control. For years I imagined that money as a quiet promise, a safety net for the hard winters ahead, maybe even a little gift to pass down with love, and in just one reckless decision, it was all ripped away. I wanted to scream, I wanted to demand an answer, but the words never left my lips, they just sat heavy in my chest. My eyes searched the room, as though the walls themselves would explain how someone I raised, someone who grew from my own care, could look at our sacrifice and see only numbers to be spent on empty promises from a stranger on a screen. That night, I could not sleep. Every shadow on the wall seemed to whisper the same question over and over. How could he? And still, I held on to silence, because sometimes the wound of betrayal is too fresh for words. And all you can do is sit there, holding yourself together, praying that strength will find you before the morning comes. I sometimes think back to the years that led us here, the long days and longer nights when we had nothing but each other and a dream that one day life would be easier. I was a young wife then, working small jobs, sewing, cleaning, saving coins in a jar, while my husband bent his back to labor that wore him down piece by piece. We never took grand trips or filled our closets with fine clothes. We told ourselves over and over that every sacrifice had a purpose, that if we lived simply now, there would come a day when we could breathe freely and rest without worry. That money we saved was not just paper in the bank. It was the sum of our lives, the quiet reward for decades of patience and discipline. I remember the pride in my husband's eyes when he would come home tired, slip his earnings into my hand and whisper, "This is for us, for tomorrow." We raised our son with those same values, or so we thought. He grew up in a home where lights were sometimes dimmed to save the bill, where new shoes were bought only when the old ones had holes, but where love was never short. Every plate of food we put on the table carried the taste of sacrifice. Every warm coat on his back was bought with hours we would never get back. I believed he understood. I believed he saw the truth of our lives and would carry it with him. And for many years I thought he did. But as he grew older, I began to notice small changes. A hunger in him for more than what he had, a restlessness that no simple comfort could cure. He was bright, quick with his words, and always dreaming of bigger things. But I worried that those dreams were not built on work, but on shortcuts. Still, I clung to faith, because what else can a mother do except believe that her son will not throw away what cost her so much? Looking back now, I see all the moments that warned me, little sparks of carelessness, little choices that spoke louder than his promises. And I cannot help but wonder if we failed him by giving too much, by protecting him from the hunger we endured, by shielding him from the lessons that only hardship can teach. These thoughts swirl in my mind even now, mixing sorrow with guilt, love with disappointment. Because it is not just the loss of money that weighs me down. It is the fear that in all our efforts to provide, we somehow planted the seed of our own heartbreak. It all began so quietly that I almost missed it. A small change in his tone when he spoke about someone new in his life. a light in his eyes that I had not seen in years. He said he had met a woman online, someone kind, beautiful, and misunderstood, someone who had seen in him what others never did. At first I smiled. I wanted to be happy for him, because what mother does not wish to see her son loved? But as the days passed, the details did not fit together. Her stories shifted, her needs grew, and suddenly there were excuses about why she could not meet in person, why her camera was always broken, why she needed just a little help until she was free from her troubles. He would talk about her with such conviction, describing her as though she were an angel fallen into his arms. Yet every word carried the weight of desperation, and every request she made was answered with his unquestioning loyalty. My husband and I sat together at night whispering, wondering if this was real, if perhaps we were too cautious, or if we were watching a trap close in around him. I wanted to shake him and demand he see the truth. But love can blind a man more than any darkness, and in his eyes, she was salvation. I told myself it was only a phase, that soon he would see what we saw. Yet deep down I feared that what began as harmless affection was about to become the storm that would sweep away everything we had built. The first signs were small, little amounts missing from the account that I thought might have been a mistake or some bill I had forgotten. But as the weeks went by, those numbers grew larger, and the explanations he gave grew weaker. He told me she had a medical emergency, then that she was stranded in another country waiting for a flight, and later that her documents had been stolen and she needed help to get home. Each time he spoke, his voice shook with emotion, and though the stories never lined up, he defended her as though she were his entire world. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late one night, staring at the statement in my hands, my heart pounding as I traced the withdrawals line by line, each one a piece of our life slipping away. When I asked him about it, he grew angry, his eyes burning with a mix of shame and defiance, shouting that I did not understand love, that he was the only one who could save her. It felt like watching a stranger speak through the face of the boy I raised, and in that moment I realized he was no longer listening to reason. He was lost in something deeper, something dangerous. I wanted to reach for him, to remind him of who we were and all that we had sacrificed for him, but my voice caught in my throat and my husband's hand tightened over mine, steady but heavy, as though he knew the truth I was only beginning to face. Our savings were gone, and with them, the trust that had held this family together. I remember that night as if it were carved into my skin, the house so quiet you could hear the clock tick in the hallway, and me sitting at the table with my hands still clutching that bank statement like it might change if I just stared at it long enough. My husband sat across from me, not speaking, his face pale, his jaw set in a way I had only seen a few times before in our marriage. Moments when he carried the weight of the world but refused to let it crush him. I wanted him to explode, to shout at our son, to demand he stop before it was too late, but he did not. He simply reached across the table, laid his rough hand gently over mine, and whispered words I will never forget. "Don't worry, my darling, I'll take care of it." There was no anger in his voice, no panic, just a kind of resolve that chilled me more than any outburst ever could. The next morning he woke before the sun, moving quietly through the house, gathering papers, printing emails, making calls that I could not fully hear from the other room. His movements were deliberate, each one steady, as though he had already decided on a path I could not yet see. He carried folders with him, sat hunched over the old desk in the corner, his glasses slipping down his nose as he studied lines of text, numbers, and names that meant nothing to me, but seemed to carry heavy meaning for him. When I asked what he was doing, he only gave me a tired smile and said, "Leave this with me." I watched him walk out the door later that day, shoulders squared, determination in every step, and I felt both pride and fear. Pride because this man, my partner of decades, still had the strength to stand for us even in the face of heartbreak, and fear because I had no idea what he was walking into, or whether he could fix something that already seemed broken beyond repair. The hours stretched into days, 3 long days of silence where I barely slept, waiting for the sound of his key in the door, praying he would return with good news, dreading that he might come back with none at all. In those quiet nights, I thought about the years of marriage we had shared, about the storms we had survived together, and I held on to the hope that his calmness was not surrender, but a plan. Still, a knot of worry grew in my chest, because though he told me not to worry, I knew the truth. Behind his steady eyes and strong voice, he was hurting too. And while he was out there chasing answers, I was left with the echo of his words, "I'll take care of it." Wondering if love and determination would be enough to pull us back from the edge. Those 3 days felt like 3 lifetimes, each hour dragging with the weight of fear and uncertainty. And though he had told me not to worry, I could not help but sit by the window, staring at the empty driveway, listening for footsteps that never came. When he finally returned late on the 3rd night, his face told me more than words ever could. The lines etched deeper. His shoulders stooped not from age, but from the heaviness of what he had seen and done. He sat down slowly, his hands trembling as he pulled out the papers he had carried with him. And for the first time in all our years together, I saw tears clinging to his eyes before a single word was spoken. He began to explain in a voice that cracked and faltered, how he had followed the trail of emails and transactions, each one leading further from innocence and closer to the truth. He had tracked the names and numbers, finding they were all false, fabricated identities. A web of lies spun so carefully that it preyed on every weakness in our son's heart. He told me how he had contacted banks, how he had spoken with people who knew these patterns, how he had pieced together that it was not one girl at all, but a group, professionals who used the same words to fool countless others. He even tried to confront them through the phone, listening to the hollow promises, the pleading tones, and the scripted lines they used to hold him captive in their story. He said it was like hearing an echo, no emotion behind the words, just the cold rhythm of deception. And what crushed him most was that even with proof in his hands, with documents that showed every lie, our son refused to believe it. He defended her with the same fire he once defended his childhood dreams, insisting she was real, that she loved him, that we were cruel for doubting. My husband looked at me then, and the tears finally fell, because it was not only our money that was lost, it was our son's trust, his judgment, and perhaps even his future. He said he had taken everything to the authorities, handed over the evidence, given them what they needed to pursue the fraud, but no matter what justice came from it, nothing could undo the damage already done to our family. I listened, my heart breaking alongside his, as he confessed that for the first time in his life he felt powerless. Powerless not against the criminals, but against the blindness of the boy we loved. I reached for his hand, holding it tightly, and in that moment I realized that the true loss was not measured in dollars, but in the widening distance between us and the child we had raised. It was a wound deeper than any bank account could show. And as the night stretched on, the silence between us spoke louder than any words we could manage. The days that followed were some of the hardest I have ever lived through, because once the truth had been laid bare, once my husband had shown him every shred of evidence, every false name, every fabricated story, still he clung to the lie with a desperation that tore through me like glass. He looked at us not with the eyes of a son who had been rescued from danger, but with the eyes of a man who believed his parents were the enemy, who thought we were standing in the way of his happiness. He raised his voice, his words sharp and heavy, accusing us of being controlling, of being unwilling to see him as a man capable of love. I can still hear the anger in his tone, how he shouted that she was the only one who cared for him, that we were jealous, that we wanted him alone and miserable. Every word landed like a blow, and though I tried to stay steady, inside my heart cracked with each sentence, because there is no pain greater than being cast as the villain in the story, when all you ever did was sacrifice for someone you loved. My husband sat quietly as our son raged, his hands folded tightly on the table, his lips pressed in a thin line, but his silence carried more weight than any response could. I knew in his stillness he was breaking too, because he had spent 3 days chasing shadows, hoping to save not just our money but the dignity of our family, only to be met with rejection from the very person he sought to protect. I tried to reach across that chasm with my words, reminding him of the childhood we had given him, of the nights we went without so he could have shoes on his feet, books in his bag, food on his plate, but he would not hear me. His face was hardened, his jaw set, and in that moment, it felt as though love had no place in him, only the grip of a dream that was never real. That night, after the shouting ended and the house grew quiet again, I sat alone in the dark and wondered how a heart so carefully nurtured could wander so far into blindness. I pressed my hands together, whispering prayers not for the money we had lost, but for the son I feared we were losing too. And when I turned to my husband, I saw him wipe his eyes quickly, as though I had not noticed, and I realized that even the strongest man I had ever known could not carry this without breaking. We held each other in silence, no words left to say. Only the weight of betrayal pressing down on us both, and the echo of a question neither of us dared to voice aloud. Would he ever see the truth, or had we already lost him forever? The silence that lingered after those nights was heavier than any argument. It wrapped itself around the house like a fog, settling into every corner and leaving me restless. I would wake in the early hours of the morning and sit by the window, staring into the darkness outside, replaying every word he had thrown at us, every accusation, every defense of someone who had never even stood before him in the flesh. I tried to remind myself that anger often comes from fear, that his defiance was not hatred of us, but a desperate attempt to protect the fantasy he could not let go of. Yet that thought brought little comfort when the hurt was so deep. My husband would sit with me sometimes, his hand resting over mine, his eyes fixed on the floor, and though he said little, I could feel the same torment inside him, the same helplessness that had begun to hollow us out from within. I found myself drifting back through memories, to the days when our son was small and would come running into my arms without hesitation, when his trust in us was unshakable, when he believed every promise we made because our love was enough. Those days felt like another lifetime now, as though the boy we had raised had been replaced by a stranger who could look us in the eyes and still choose the voice of a faceless deceiver over the truth we laid before him. I told myself that this blindness could not last forever, that one day the walls of lies would crumble, and he would be forced to see what we had seen all along. But each time I hoped, each time I prayed for a flicker of recognition, I was met only with the same stubborn words, the same unwavering belief that she was real and that we were wrong. In those moments, I began to understand a cruel truth, that losing money, no matter how much, is nothing compared to losing the bond you thought could never be broken. I could bear the empty account. I could bear the long years of sacrifice gone with a few clicks on a screen. But what I struggled to bear was the distance in his eyes, the refusal to let us guide him back to safety. And yet, even in the midst of this heartbreak, I knew that my love for him could not simply disappear. It stayed lodged in my chest like a weight I could not set down, a reminder that no matter how far he strayed, a part of me would always wait for him to return. It was not long before the cracks in his perfect story began to show, because lies have a way of unraveling no matter how tightly they are spun. One evening he came to us, his face pale, his hands shaking, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear in his eyes instead of anger. He told us she had stopped answering his calls, that her messages had grown shorter, that suddenly the woman who once wrote him endless words of devotion had gone silent. He tried to laugh it off, saying maybe her phone was broken, maybe she was busy, but I could see the truth dawning on him in every line of his expression. Days passed, and the silence only deepened. Her accounts disappeared, her promises dissolved into nothing, and the walls of the fantasy he clung to crumbled around him. When he finally admitted it, when he came to us with his head bowed and his voice breaking, begging for forgiveness, I felt a mixture of sorrow and anger so strong it nearly stole my breath. He cried as he confessed that the woman he believed in had vanished without a trace, that the money was gone, and he had nothing left to show for it but shame. My husband stood beside me, his eyes dark with disappointment, and though neither of us spoke harshly, our silence was enough to remind him of what he had done. It was not victory that filled the room, not satisfaction at being proven right, but a hollow ache, because we did not want to see him broken. We wanted to see him wise before it was too late. He fell to his knees, saying he did not know how to make it right, that he could not believe how blind he had been. And for a moment, I almost reached out to lift him, to hold him the way I had when he was small and frightened. But my hands stayed at my sides, because love cannot erase consequences, and some lessons can only be learned through the pain they bring. As I looked at him there, fragile in his regret, I knew that though he finally saw the truth, the damage had already been done, and the road back to trust would be longer than either of us could have imagined. In that moment, watching him kneeling there with his pride shattered and his voice broken, I felt the full weight of what had been lost. Not just the money that had slipped from our hands, but the trust that once bound us tightly as a family. My husband stood so still beside me, his silence louder than any words, and I could see in his eyes the battle he was fighting, torn between the urge to lift our son and the need to let him feel the sting of his own choices. I wanted to believe that this confession was the beginning of change, that finally he understood the depth of his mistake. Yet even as I listened to his pleas, a part of me knew that forgiveness could not come quickly, because betrayal does not heal with a single apology. We sat him at the table, the same table where laughter and warmth once filled the air, and now it was heavy with disappointment. He begged for us to help him, to cover the debts he could not pay, to repair what he had thrown away so carelessly. I looked into his eyes and saw both the boy I had raised and the man who had wounded us so deeply, and the conflict inside me nearly tore me apart. My husband spoke then, his voice low and steady, telling him that love would not shield him from the weight of his decisions, that this time he would need to carry it himself. Our son lowered his head, his tears falling freely, and I could almost feel the walls of the home pressing in on us, as though the very house shared in the sorrow that lingered there. That night, when the lights were out and the rooms were quiet again, I lay awake beside my husband, staring into the dark and listening to the sound of his breathing, each breath heavy with unspoken pain. I thought about how easily love can blind, how quickly devotion can turn to destruction. And I whispered to myself that perhaps this heartbreak was the only way he would ever learn. It was a cruel comfort, but it was all I had. Because even as I prayed for him to rebuild his life, I knew we could not carry the burden for him anymore. As the days passed, we knew we had to make a choice. And it was not an easy one. He wanted us to fix everything, to sweep away the debt and the shame as though it had never happened. But deep in my heart, I knew that would only chain him to the same blindness that had brought us here. My husband and I sat him down once more, and with voices steady but filled with sorrow, we told him that we loved him but we would not rescue him this time. He would have to work to rebuild piece by piece, and to prove with actions rather than words that he could be trusted again. His face fell and the tears returned, but we did not waver, because love is not about sparing someone from pain, it is about guiding them through it, even when they despise you for it. We secured what little we had left, placed it beyond his reach, and set new boundaries so the years of sacrifice that remained would not vanish again. My husband took quiet steps to protect our future, changing accounts, locking away what could still be saved, while I tried to gather the strength to face each day without letting bitterness consume me. And though my heart ached every time I looked at him, I reminded myself that some lessons are only learned when the heart breaks and the hands are forced to build anew. In the quiet that followed, I came to realize that what we lost was not only measured in dollars, it was measured in trust, in faith, in the innocence of believing that love alone would be enough to keep us safe from harm. Yet even through the pain, I understood that this was not the end. It was a lesson, one carved into our hearts so deeply it could never be forgotten. We would go on, my husband and I, holding tighter to each other, guarding what little remained, and praying that our son would find his way back to wisdom through the hard road he now had to walk. And though the hurt will linger, I hold on to the truth that dignity is not in what you own, but in how you endure when everything seems broken. Thank you, my dear. for staying with me until the end of my story. Your time means more than you know, and if my words have touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments and to subscribe, because there are more truths to tell, and perhaps one of them will feel like your own.